You're listening to Everybody Pulls the Tarp, the go-to podcast for high performers. I'm Andrew Moses. Each week, you'll hear my thought-provoking conversations with Olympians, pro athletes, CEOs, elite coaches, best-selling authors, and other high performers to uncover their secrets to success. Get ready to be inspired each week when we talk about leadership, teamwork, work ethic, and more. Are you ready? Let's go. This week, my guest is Jesse Serventi. Jesse is the founding partner of Renovus Capital, a private equity firm that manages over $1 billion. Renovus has a portfolio of more than 25 U.S.-based businesses across a variety of industries, including education, healthcare, technology, professional services, and more. Jesse grew up in a small rural area outside of Buffalo, New York, in a town he says has more cows than people. He's part of a family with a long line of hardworking entrepreneurs. Jesse's great-grandparents owned and operated bowling alleys, movie theaters, and pool halls. Later, his grandfather and great-uncle operated a cookie distributor and eventually built a commercial bakery business. Jesse has always admired his family's work ethic, can-do spirit, and knew that someday he wanted to be an entrepreneur as well. After college, he started his career at Citigroup. And when an entirely new career opportunity presented itself to build his own company, he says it was the easiest decision he's ever made. In our conversation, Jesse shared the basics of how private equity works and how his team identifies entrepreneurs, leaders, and businesses to partner with. You'll also hear actionable lessons on uniting teams and people around a common goal, how to build long-term relationships, and why a series of stand-up comedy classes helped Jesse grow as a leader. This episode is filled with powerful lessons about leadership, betting on yourself, following your passions, and so much more. I can't wait for you to hear it. So, let's pull the tarp and get straight to Jesse Serventi. For my listeners who are not familiar, well, what is private equity and how does it work? In a minute or two. I know that's a hard task to explain in a minute or two, but what's private equity? How does it work? And what are all kind of the models behind it?
Private equity is the buying of stock in companies that are not sold in the public market. So that's why it's called private. So the companies that we invest in can't otherwise be purchased through like the New York Stock Exchange. You can't get an E-Trade account and buy interest in these companies. You have to buy them directly from their private owners. So that's kind of where private equity got its name. And it's an industry that's evolved a lot over the last probably 40 years or so. And it's grown from this cottage industry of the leveraged buyout world of the 1980s to a multi-trillion-dollar industry that it is today.
Jesse, I'm curious, what was the first exposure for you to the private equity business model? Where did you learn about it? And what fascinated you most about it?
I was really lucky to have an internship in college at a private equity firm. My story is that I grew up in the Buffalo area, and to say it's from Buffalo is kind of generous. I'm actually from a town that has more cows than people, so a very rural environment. I grew up in a family business, and I always admired my family members who had built the business and always wanted to be a business person. So when I got into college, I had this view of like, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to be like my family. And I was in college in like the late 90s and early 2000s. And at that time, Wall Street was a very exciting place to be. Companies were going public every day. And I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to get in on that action as like the first place to start my career. But I always had this view of getting back into being an entrepreneur. And to me, private equity kind of seemed like the middle ground. You're very involved in transactions. You're doing things that were closely related to Wall Street and were involved in the excitement of Wall Street, but you're also working very closely with these businesses that I was really passionate about given my upbringing. And so that's what drew me to private equity. And like I said, I'm from the Buffalo, New York area, and there's not a lot of private equity firms in that area, but I got an internship at one of the well-known ones. And that's where I first got exposed to it, and I was probably 20 years old.
Jesse, there's a lot I want to unpack there. Family business, growing up in a rural area, an exciting internship. Let's start with growing up in a rural area. You said your hometown had more cows than people. What did you enjoy most about growing up in a place like that? And maybe what were some of the big lessons and ideas that you still take with you today?
I loved growing up there. Anything I knew, so I didn't know what else was really out there. But so I'm from a county called Wyoming County, and I think the stats are has 45,000 cows in Wyoming County and about 40,000 people. And I lived in the county seat of Wyoming County called Warsaw. It had a stoplight, a McDonald's, and a Walmart, and a hospital and a jail. So those were the big frills of the county seat. The house I grew up in was literally across the street from my high school. And the high school was also the elementary school. So everything was very central. You could walk to all your friends' houses. You literally walked 30 seconds across the street to school every morning. And my house was like Grand Central Station after school before sports practices began. And it was just, obviously I knew everyone in my grade. I knew everyone in the school. And it was a really nice way to grow up because you were familiar with everything and everything felt very safe. It was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors at night.
Now, I'm curious, when you think about the things that you got to see being part of a family that owned its own business, and what were some of the takeaways for you from being part of a family-owned business and growing up around that?
Yeah, a lot of takeaways. So the story of the family business was that it goes back to my grandfather and great uncle, who was his brother. They were the sons of Italian immigrants, and they grew up in Western Pennsylvania in the early 20th century. Their parents, so my great grandparents, were entrepreneurs, and they operated bowling alleys, movie theaters, and pool halls. And my grandfather and his brother, they grew up in an apartment that was on top of their family's movie theater. And so from a young age, they were working. Working was part of a way of life for them, involved in the family business. And they grew up that way. They went and they fought in World War II. And when they came home, one of the things that my grandpa and uncle always boasted about was that they never looked for jobs. They always looked to be in business. I guess I didn't tell you the part was that during World War II, because of everything that was happening with the economy, and then post-World War II with the TV becoming popular, the movie theater business was on the decline and the family business was really on the decline. So they came back and they looked for a new business to be in, and they were proud. They never looked for jobs. They looked to own things. And so they got in the business of basically being a cookie distributor. And that led them to start a bakery, a commercial bakery. And they got a good tax deal to set it up in Wyoming County, Western New York. That's what led them from Western Pennsylvania to New York State and allowed them to kind of build the business there. So I love that they were entrepreneurs. I love that they never looked for jobs. And I really admired something that they always said was the key to the family business success, which is that the family members put the other members of the family before themselves. So I love your thing about everyone pulls the tarp. I think that fits very well with like the ethos of my family. There's no job too small. You play as a team. You put others before yourself. And that was a big thing for me as well.
Jesse, it's just such a fascinating story. I love hearing people tell these stories of multi-generational entrepreneurs and family owned and family led businesses. Is there a story or two that you've been told through the years that has really stuck with you about a time that they really battled adversity in the business, or some nitty gritty kind of non-glamorous thing that they needed to do to stay on the tracks? I'm curious, is there a story or something that stands out for you that you've heard over the years?
The business life today, even if you're not an executive, you're just maybe you're a junior person working at a financial services firm or as a consultant, and maybe you're a flying coach and staying at the Courtyard Marriott. It's a lot cushier now, even though that's sort of considered maybe the low end of business life today, business travel today. It's much better than it used to be. One of the policies for the family and for the family business for, I think, decades was that when you went out on the road, you had a roommate, and you would, they would make you share a bed, but you slept in the room with a colleague, another salesperson. And I think of that as sort of like, boy, that is really different than the way things are today. And my partners in my business, Renovus, and I have laughed about that story because when we were first getting going and no money, we actually shared rooms, but I don't think very many people are doing that anymore. But that was life back then. And the value orientation, the cost focus that they needed to have just to get the business off the ground after World War II was tremendous, and a much greater focus on cost than I think most entrepreneurs need to have today.
So that's a great segue, Jesse. You talked about founding Renovus. You're the founding partner at Renovus Capital. What went into the thought process that you had to launch your own business and build and lead something yourself? Take me through that thought process for you.
Sure. So always wanting to be an entrepreneur like my family members, I got into investment banking after college, which was my plan. And I worked really hard to get a good investment banking job. But while I was in that job, I always wanted to be an entrepreneur. And I thought I'd do something as, owning a traditional operating business. As I mentioned to you, I was interested in private equity because it was kind of the intersection between Wall Street and being a business owner. So after investment banking, I went into private equity. And when I was in private equity, I met a couple of people who I worked for who I just thought were incredible investors. I developed a lot of confidence in them and trust in them. And we were working together at a firm in New York. And at some point, we decided to start talking about starting our own firm. And those discussions were happening at the height of the GFC. And this is a great recession, terrible to be starting a business, a really terrible time to start a capital intensive business where you need a lot of money to get into business like private equity. And these guys who were my bosses at the time invited me to be their partner with them in starting Renovus. And I tell people that it was actually the easiest career decision I've ever made. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I had tremendous confidence and trust in them. I was a junior guy at the time. They were inviting me to be their partner. And I thought to myself, like, look, you're only going to get this kind of opportunity maybe once or twice in your life. So, there was a lot of bad things going on economically. I'm a big believer in the power of people, and that people are a power law. And so when I was invited by them to be their partner, that was an easy decision, and off we went.
Jesse, to double click into that a little bit, are there traits that you look for in people that you want to partner with in business and in the leaders at the companies that you ultimately acquire at Renovus? Are there a couple of things that you're looking for from an individual relationship perspective, from an individual kind of qualities perspective? Talk about that for a moment.
Sure. Look, I think that to be a business leader, like to be a CEO, I think is an incredibly hard job. I think it's a harder job than my job. And so it takes a special person to be able to do it. I think a few of the key ingredients that you need to be successful in that job is one, you got to be all in. To lead a company takes an enormous amount of effort. And so somebody who is fully committed to their business. I think a second thing is that, sort of a test of CEO is CEO needs to know what to do. And then they also need to get the company to do what they know. And so the first piece is about really kind of having the right strategy and vision for the company. And the second piece is about being a good leader and manager and being able to get people to follow you to execute on that vision. And so if we're thinking about backing a company or buying a company, we want to see a CEO that possesses all three of those. They're all in, they know what to do, and they can get the team to follow.
Jesse, on the all in, what does that look like? How do you define when someone's all in? Is that something that you're looking for in terms of their energy, in terms of a financial commitment that they're making? What does all in look like to you? And how do you know if someone's all in?
Man, that is such a great question. And one that I think, like, assessing, are they all in or are they not all in? And I think it's a little bit of a kind of question. And my business is an apprenticeship business, and you kind of learn it by being in it and watching it for a number of years as I've been now. A bunch of just signals kind of look for. Is a person telling you, are they making the right monetary signals? Are they personally investing? Oh, how much money are they investing relative to what they have? Okay, check that box. The way they talk about the business, the way their team talks about them, because it's important to us, like when we're diligencing a company, we want to meet with people individually because we want to see what they say about each other. Will they say the same things when they're all together as they'll say when they're not all together? And listening to how they talk about the CEO and the way the CEO leads and engages with them, that's another piece of it. And just, the way the CEO kind of interacts with us, like how responsive are they? Do I have a kind of an email relationship with that person, or do I have a texting relationship? Because we're back and forth very quickly at off hours. So just little things, little kind of signals that you're trying to pick up on to assess, is this person truly committed? And kind of doing that assessment and investigation is one of the job that I really enjoy.
What about red flags? Like, are there just things that if something happens, if you see something in a leader or you see something in a management team or a business partner, that is a non-starter for me? Is there anything like that you're looking for, that you're really on? Maybe it's not all or nothing is a hard thing to quantify, but I mean, is there something that puts your antennas up when you hear or see it in terms of a leadership quality or lack thereof?
Oh, sure. Yeah, well, certainly the financial one. If they're not, voting with their wallet, that is certainly one very strong indication. We look for consistency. Anyone can be really on in one meeting, but these processes where you get to spend a lot of time with a team or with the CEO before you make an investment, you get to observe them over a period of months and developing that relationship and seeing, like, okay, is every interaction consistent? Am I being surprised by things? Am I doing references to me are more, I say they're more valuable than any like interview or meeting that I have directly with the person, because, somebody can be on their best behavior with you, certainly for one meeting and oftentimes for many, many meetings. But, when you can get to people who truly know them and have worked with them and seen them in action for years, like that certainly doesn't lie. And so are the references that we get, both the ones that were given by the company or by the CEO, but the ones that we're able to dig up on our own by finding, common LinkedIn connections, like, are those references saying consistent things from one person to the next?
Relationships are so critical. I'm continuously, amazed and just such a believer in the power of relationships and how valuable those are. And I think a lot of what you said there, I was taking down some notes. Consistency. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations on this podcast with people where they say, look at someone during a time of adversity, right? Like, it's easy to look at somebody
Sure.
and try and understand what they're all about and how they operate when things are going really well. But when they're backed into a little bit of a corner, when the going gets a little bit tough, are they the same person? It's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the test, and it's why having references are so valuable. When a company is for sale, it's typically for sale when things are going generally pretty well, and they're going to be on their best behavior. And so, getting to those people and who have seen them through thick and thin, that's really a test.
Jesse, I'm curious as we think about kind of like the next phase of the journey in terms of a private equity deal and acquiring a business. You talked a lot about what you look for and how you guys go about diligencing a business and what you're looking for. Once you buy a business, how do you go about affecting the change that you want to affect, standing up, things that you want to stand up, but not disrupting the apple cart? How do you find that right balance in, working together with the company once you own the business?
Sure. I think the key to it is communication, a lot of communication, before we buy the business on what it's going to be like to work together. And then, when a company is acquired, they're expecting change. And so there's a window of time when you can get in there when the expectations are aligned with change. So I think you need to act quickly. 85% of the businesses that we buy have never had an institutional investor in them. So we're the first private equity money or venture money that's coming into the company. One of the team members who we're working with, a guy named Renovus Capital, he's a retired CEO, and now he works with us as operating partner. And he knows the private equity world very well because he worked for a private equity owned company. And he has this term, the demystification of private equity, that is really needed by these small businesses that we buy. Because let's say we buy this family owned business that's been family owned for 20 or 30 years, and they announce, okay, private equity firms now partnering with us, they're acquiring us, and here comes Renovus. And what Renat says, which I agree with, is people are terrified. They've read negative things in the press about me. They're worried about how their lives are going to be affected. Will they have a job? Will my benefits change? Will my comp change? How's the culture going to change? This is really scary. And so what we do before we buy is we'll come in and talk with the senior team a lot about, okay, what it's going to be like to work with us. Here's how the board is going to work. These are the decisions the board's going to make. These are the decisions that the management team doesn't need to consult the board on going forward. And through a series of meetings, the management team usually gets really comfortable with that even before we close. Then we'll close and we'll typically do like a town hall meeting where I'll get up there and we'll have some outside board members as well get up there and talk either in person or through Zoom with everyone that works in the company. We just introduce ourselves. We tell our story. We tell some of the things that I've been talking about with you today, just to kind of humanize me a little bit, let them know that this is what we're about. This is the firm overview. And this is why we bought your company. And this is what we plan to do with it. And I think just like, having that single conversation immediately puts people at ease, and just clearly communicating what it's going to be like to work with us. Then people, okay, they might not love everything that they hear, but at least they know how it's going to work. And I find that's been really.
Jesse, why do you think it is that sometimes private equity just gets a bad rap? And like you said, people are afraid of what's next when a private equity firm gets involved. Why is that?
I think it can be for a bunch of different reasons. The private equity firms, a lot of them, like historically, made their money on financial engineering and borrowing a ton of money, putting in a very little amount of their own money, their equity, to buy a company. And, we say like, business doesn't move in a straight line. Things kind of, move up and down, but hopefully where you end is in a better place than where you start. But if you have a very levered balance sheet, if you go through a momentary blip, that sheet and the leverage and the others can get the best of the company. And that has plagued a bunch of private equity deals historically. If you get really tight on your financial covenants with your lender, you get into trouble with your lender, You have to start making cost cuts. You have to start making short-term decisions that are not well received by the management or the employees of the company and are probably not in the best interest of the company long term, but they need to be done in order to solve a near-term problem. And sometimes those problems continue to mount, and the company just goes further and further off the rails. More people at the company get laid off, maybe wages are reduced, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And there's been under like high praise like that in the media. I think what is more often the case today, certainly with us, but I think with the industry at large, is like private equity is there to invest in the business. Like we are change agents, and the change we want is growth. And growth doesn't come just because a change of ownership occurs. In order to drive growth, you got to invest. And the way that we add value to most of our portfolio companies is a combination of continuing to build teams. So hiring people, that requires capital and money. So we're investing that way. And we're also doing strategic mergers and acquisitions to help the companies grow, add new product lines or service lines to get greater scale. And that requires investment as well. So I think like it's certainly true of us, but I believe it's true of the industry, that the private equity industry as a whole is much more about investing than private businesses that are not private equity owned are able to do. So I think it's a misconception that I think is changing over time. Like if I look back at the 2012 presidential election, and Mitt Romney was painted in a very negative light for being a private equity investor. I think if another private equity investor ran for office, major office today, I don't think they would be painted in as negative a light because the truth is coming out, and over time, people are seeing that private equity does good than bad.
It's an interesting way of looking at it, Jesse, and I think we are going to see more of that favorable light on the industry as we think about wrapping up our conversation. I have learned so much. We've known each other for some time, and I didn't know anything about your roots outside of Buffalo and the family-owned businesses and how entrepreneurship runs through your blood. As you think about all that you've accomplished and everything that you're going to accomplish ahead of you, do you think that you come from a unique vantage point of empathy and awareness and just overall perspective about what these founders and business leaders are going through? And do you think that helps you bridge the gap?
I do. That's just part of, I think being out there with my story and just being authentic is a really important part of whatever success I've been able to achieve. And I think that's important for anyone to be successful. Like something that we haven't touched on, but as I was starting the firm and going from a very junior role to a more senior role where I'm people facing, talking with investors, I'm talking with company about investing, decided that, hey, I need to get comfortable kind of being on stage more. And so what I did was I took a series of stand-up comedy classes, which I am not a natural stand-up comedian at all. And that was the reason why I did it, because I wanted to push myself to be more comfortable kind of being on stage. And it was both a horrible and an amazing experience. But the number one takeaway I had from it was that you need to be authentic. Like the joke you're telling needs to be your joke. You can't tell somebody else's joke. And when I talk about Renovus and who we are as investors, what I'm like to work with if I invest in your company, I try to just be completely up about my story, how I got to where I am, and what it's going to be like to work with me. And I found that tends to work pretty well.
It's so fascinating that I'm learning so much about you, Jesse, that you took some of the classes in comedy and tried your hand as a stand-up comedian. I have read and heard more and more about people studying the art of stand-up comedy and watching stand-up comedians, because whether people realize it or not on the surface, there's so much that they're doing that we can learn from: storytelling, the way they deliver messages, authenticity, like you described there, the preparation and the reps that they have to get to get good at what they do, the consistency that requires. Plus, you learned from that experience to push yourself outside your comfort zone and challenge different skill sets that you felt like needed some development. So kudos to you for giving that a try. Stand-up comedy, Jesse Serventi, I didn't know that was part of your history, but we learn so much when we sit down and we have these conversations. There is no question you are a tarp puller. I have learned so much from our discussion today. Thank you so much for spending some time with me, and keep pulling the tarp. And I know the best is still yet to come for Jesse Serventi and Renovus Capital.
Andrew, thanks so much for having me on. It was fun.
Thank you for joining me this week. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you can catch all of our upcoming episodes. And if you are like me and want a world full of tarp pullers, then leave a review to help others find us. You can also follow me on Twitter at Andrew H. Moses. That's Andrew H. Moses. And be sure to sign up for my email newsletter at everybodypullsthetarp.com/newsletter. I'll share tips and insights to help you achieve maximum success and happiness. Today's a great day to pull the tarp. I am rooting for you. See you next time.